Hey guys, how's it going? Kevin Cleary here with a knife review for you. Today we're taking a look at this Lionsteel, and this is the big Daghetta. And it gets that name because it's a bigger version of the original Daghetta. And that's an older design from the early 2000s. The designer is a guy by the name of Massimo Salis Sana. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that something like the way it's supposed to be. Not a bad knife at all. It's definitely very reminiscent of like the SOG Pentagon Elite. There's some Gerbers that have sort of a dagger style, or even the Benchmade 530, 531. So if you're into those knives, this one might be interesting to you, especially because it's a little bigger and a little more heavily built. So more of a utility folder than some of those others that I mentioned. I guess the Pentagon Elite would be pretty utilitarian as well. I would say this is in even a little higher level of quality than that one, or pretty much most SOGs. So I will say this by way of just, sharing my own biases. I'm not a huge fan of dagger style blades. I just, I don't mind spear point blades if they're ground higher, but I'm not I'm not in love with the look of the dagger style. That said, I don't mind this knife that much. There's a lot of things that it does right, and we'll kind of talk about those things as we go through. So let's go ahead and get to size and weight. First off, this knife, it is 8 5/8 inches overall. The blade here is 3 11/16. The handle is just under 5 inches at 4 7/8. And the weight on this is a reasonable 4.5 ounces. So not too bad. And I will say when it comes to carrying this knife, it actually carries really, really well. So if you're looking for a larger knife that is extremely easy to carry, this is definitely a good option for you. Drops into the pocket, the clip works exceptionally well, carries very deep. The only issue I do have is from time to time I had a hard time getting a hold of it, but not anything that was excessive where I would actually have to say that's like a negative on the knife. Let's go ahead and talk about this blade. Now I've already said I'm not in love with the blade shape, but the blade finish, the steel, those kinds of things are pretty well done. I like the satin grind. It is D2 and Lionsteel does a lot of their, so this is available in like a titanium version as well. And so the G10 version with the D2 is kind of typical of the way Lionsteel operates. And D2 is going to be a pretty good steel, but not entirely stainless. So keep that in the back of your mind. If you want this, the steel is going to perform well in terms of edge retention and toughness, but you are going to have to give it a little more care to keep it from rusting. Let me speak about the cutting edge just a little. This knife, to a lesser extent, commits one of the things, or has one of the problems that I find pretty typical of Lionsteel, and that is it's a little thick behind the edge. Now, it's not super thick where it won't cut anything, but it's a little thicker than I'd like to see it, especially given the sort of slim nature of this knife. Okay, this doesn't strike me as sort of this hard use, heavy duty knife, and yet the blade definitely has a heavy duty edge on it. Maybe that's accommodating D2. D2 likes to be ground a little thicker, but I would have preferred a thinner blade profile a thinner edge geometry for sure. The stock is not all that thick, which kind of alleviates, balances that issue a little bit. The grind though is quite low, and so that means you're getting a little more of a wedge effect. If they had ground this higher, I'm feeling like a broken record here. I think I say this about every knife I've looked at recently. But if they ground this higher, I feel like the performance would have been just a little bit better on it. Overall though, it's not terrible. It's definitely a useful blade. It does cut most things that you want it to cut with. It does cut most of the things you want it to cut, as long as you're not trying to cut like sliced tomatoes or apples or something like that. All right, moving on to lockup and deployment. This knife has the TOL, or the Tactical Operation Lock, which is essentially Lionsteel's version of the Axis lock, and it's not as good as the Axis lock, which, very few are. I do need to use two hands to actually this. From time to time, I can get it with just my thumb, but most of the time I end up doing that, where I use these two fingers to move the lock and then this guy to close it. The knife is not terribly smooth. Okay, so that's one of the problems. With a Benchmade, you can usually actuate the lock and whip it closed. This one doesn't whip closed very easily, which is odd because it's on bearings. Okay, so normally we associate bearings with a very smooth, or a very smooth, easily moving blade, but this is not an easily moving blade. I have to apply force all the time to get this to open and close, so it's not going to be a knife that's going to flick open very easily. By the way, it does have the thumb disc as the primary method of opening, but the fuller there, or you could almost call it a nail nick, it works as well. And likely this is an accommodation for places where you're not allowed to have a one-handed opening knife. So you could take this off and then just use the knife this way. All right. And that's kind of a nice feature if you're in a part of the world that requires that. So yeah, in terms of lockup and deployment, the action is not smooth, but it's definitely very functional. The lock is a variation of Benchmade's Axis lock. And if you want more details on that, I'll put a link in the description down below to a thread on Blade Forums where the Lionsteel rep actually, put the full sort of design 3D rendering on Blade Forums, and you can take a look at that. No big complaints about lockup and deployment. Very solid, very easy to use, generally speaking, other than the fact that I can't do this with one finger the way that I normally could on a Benchmade. All right, moving on to the handle of this knife. The handle is nicely done. Typical Lionsteel, good machining, good attention to detail. There's nothing, that doesn't look like it belongs or doesn't fit well with the overall design. The one thing that I was a little surprised by was the way they did this pocket clip. So it's got this angle on it, which means you can't just easily undo this screw and move it to the other side. That's a little surprising to me because it just seems like it'd be so easy to just flatten this little portion at the end and make it reversible, but they didn't choose to do that, which I thought was a little strange. Full backspacer construction. You can see that the liners are sort of minimal in there, so they're just at the back, which is a nice choice. It definitely lightens up the knife. The other thing that I want you to see right now is how narrow those G10 scales get here at the front. That does create a bit of a hot spot when you really bear down. If my hand's up here closer to the blade, then it's not so bad, but especially if I'm back here, you can really feel it. All right. In terms of reverse grip, it works fine if you put your thumb right here, and they have provided some jimping to kind of clue you in. And of course, if you've forgotten, put your thumb up here, you're going to quickly find that because of that glass breaker, it's not very comfortable. There is a carbide insert here, and really that's going to work pretty well for breaking windows. That nice fine carbide tip is going to function very well. Of course, just make sure you hit the window at the right spot and that you don't cut your arm all up by putting it through the window. Overall, that's my sort of general description of the knife and my thoughts on the various features. I want to go ahead and give you a few comparisons because while I like this knife, there are some knives that I have that I would probably lean toward. The first two being major ones for me, the Recon 1. If you're looking for a hard use utility style knife, hard to go wrong with a Recon 1. The steel is going to be a little better as well, and the price is going to be a little cheaper. The other good option would be a Spyderco Manix 2 XL. Honestly, if I'm, when I consider price and design and all of that, I'm going to take either one of these, especially because of the cutting performance on these blades over the Lionsteel. However, I know there are going to be some of you who love that dagger style design, and this is giving you a modern, sort of very well-built option. If you're a big Lionsteel fan, you maybe already have this knife. I'll pull it in as well. This is the SR11. Really cool knife, a little too thick and slick in the handle. It's similar texturing, by the way, which makes me wish this was G10 because then this would actually solve a lot of the problems that this knife has. What else have we got? For some cheaper options, and here's the other issue that I have. Got a couple of knives here. Sorry, that one's hard to reach. But these are also in D2 steel and come in at a significantly lower price point. Yeah, the machining is not quite to the same extent that Lionsteel is, and Lionsteel does a great job with fit and finish and attention to detail. And so you're definitely getting a more refined knife with the Lionsteel. So that's definitely worth considering. But if you're looking at this going, it's just too much it's more than I want to pay. Is there something with similar materials for a better price? Well, yeah, there are some options that you might want to consider. Okay, overall, what are my thoughts on this knife? Let me say this, guys. The knife is comfortable in pocket. It carries extremely easily. It gives you a nice big blade, very useful in terms of, especially heavier duty cutting tasks. It's a little thick behind the edge, as I said, and it would be nice to see an upgraded steel for this price point. The overall construction is quite good. I have no issues with it whatsoever, but there are a couple little issues with a couple little hot spots there on the bottom created by those thin scales. And so do I think this is a good knife? Yes. I have no, there's nothing that stands out to me that just ruins this knife, but it's also not my favorite knife that Lionsteel has done. And it does have a couple little things that kind of put it out of my realm of interest. The first one being, if I'm honest, just the styling itself. I'm not a big fan of dagger style folders. But then the blade, the edge grind being a little thick is the other big issue for me. So that's my take on the Lionsteel Big Daghetta. I'm always in favor of a company making a bigger version of a knife that's already out. I just love those larger knives. Let me know what you think of this down in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will talk to you soon.